He thought forcing her to play would be a harmless joke, the kind that entertained powerful men on long, expensive nights. But he had no idea he was about to witness something that would unravel his pride in front of everyone who mattered. The grand ballroom of Caldwell Heights shimmered under crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off marble floors polished to perfection, where the city's elite gathered in tailored suits and designer gowns, sipping aged whiskey and discussing deals worth millions as a Steinway grand piano stood quietly at the center like a decorative relic no one truly respected. And moving silently through the edges of that opulence was Evelyn Harper, her presence nearly invisible in a simple navy dress and worn flats, carrying a tray of champagne glasses with steady hands and eyes that avoided contact, because she had learned long ago that in rooms like this, invisibility was protection. Dominic Caldwell stood near the fireplace, his posture relaxed yet commanding, a man accustomed to being listened to without question, his voice low but cutting through conversations with ease as laughter followed him like an obedient echo. And when his gaze drifted across the room and landed on Evelyn, it lingered just a second longer than necessary, not out of curiosity but calculation, the kind that reduced people to assumptions within seconds. And in that brief moment, he decided exactly who she was, or rather, who she wasn't. A server, he thought. Nothing more. Someone who existed to serve and disappear. And as one of his guests casually mentioned the untouched piano, joking about the lack of entertainment, Dominic's lips curved into a slow smile that hinted at something sharper beneath the charm, because he had always enjoyed turning ordinary moments into performances that reminded everyone of their place. With a subtle gesture, he called over the event manager, his tone polite but edged with authority, asking if any of the staff could play something simple, his eyes never leaving Evelyn as if he had already chosen the evening's entertainment. And when she was summoned, walking toward him with measured steps, the room's attention shifted. Slightly, curious but indifferent, unaware that something irreversible had just been set in motion. "Do you play?" Dominic asked, his voice carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear. And when Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of uncertainty but memory, the corners of his mouth lifted in quiet amusement, interpreting her silence as confirmation of his expectation. "Just something light," he added, gesturing toward the piano as if offering an opportunity rather than a command. But the subtle tightening of his jaw made it clear this was not a request, and around them, a few guests exchanged knowing glances, already anticipating the awkwardness of what was about to unfold, because they had seen this kind of moment before, where someone was placed under a spotlight not to shine, but to stumble. Evelyn set the tray down carefully, her fingers lingering against the cool glass for a second longer than necessary, grounding herself in the present as the murmur of the room softened into a low hum. And as she walked toward the piano, each step echoed faintly against the marble floor, a quiet rhythm that seemed to separate her from the world behind her, where expectations had already been written without her consent. The bench creaked softly as she sat, the polished wood reflecting the chandelier light in fractured patterns, and for a moment, she didn't move, her hands resting in her lap, as if listening to something no one else could hear, while Dominic leaned casually against the piano's edge, watching with thinly veiled amusement, confident that whatever came next would serve its purpose, a brief distraction, a harmless spectacle, nothing more. But then Evelyn lifted her gaze, not toward the crowd, not toward Dominic, but somewhere beyond them, as if aligning herself with a memory that refused to be erased. And in that suspended second, something shifted, too subtle for most to notice, but enough to change the air in the room, because what Dominic had mistaken for hesitation was never uncertainty at all. And as her fingers slowly rose toward the keys, the quiet that followed was not anticipation of failure, but the calm before. Something no one in that room was prepared to understand. Her fingers hovered above the ivory keys, not trembling, not uncertain, but suspended in a kind of quiet recognition that belonged to another life entirely. And for a brief moment, the room mistook her stillness for fear, the kind that precedes embarrassment, the kind they had all come to expect, while Dominic Caldwell exhaled slowly, already satisfied with the tension he had created, his eyes scanning the nearby guests who leaned in slightly, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to subtle anticipation of discomfort, because in rooms like this, the unspoken currency was not just wealth, but dominance, and moments like these served as reminders of who held it. Evelyn's reflection stared back at her from the piano's glossy surface, distorted by the curve of the instrument, yet unmistakably steady, her face calm, her breathing even, as if she had stepped outside of the room entirely, and in her mind, the echo of a much older space began to form, one filled not with whispered judgments, but with disciplined silence, the kind that demanded excellence, not spectacle. And though no one around her could see it, that memory wrapped around her like armor, quiet and unbreakable. A soft chuckle broke from somewhere near the bar, quickly followed by another, as a guest whispered something under his breath, assuming she would fumble through a few hesitant notes before retreating, and Dominic tilted his head slightly, as if granting her the stage with a generosity that was never truly offered, his voice low but edged with amusement as he said, "Take your time, we are all listening." A statement that carried more weight than encouragement, because it was not about her performance, it was about the moment itself, the imbalance he had orchestrated so carefully. Evelyn closed her eyes, just for a second, and the world around her seemed to dim, the clinking of glasses fading, the quiet hum of conversation dissolving into nothing, replaced by a silence that was not empty, but full of years, of practice, of restraint, of choices made and paths left behind. And when her fingers finally touched the keys, it was not hesitant, not exploratory, but certain, pressing down with a control so precise it almost went unnoticed at first, the opening notes soft, deliberate, like a whisper that demanded attention rather than asked for it. The sound traveled across the marble floor, rising gently through the room, threading its way between conversations and cutting through them without force. And for a moment, no one reacted, because they were waiting for the mistake, the missed note, the confirmation of what they believed to be true, but it did not come, and instead, the melody continued, building slowly, each note placed with intention, each transition seamless. And something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the room itself had leaned in to listen more closely. Dominic's expression remained composed, but there was a slight narrowing of his eyes, a fraction of a second where his certainty paused, not enough to register fully, but enough to create a flicker of doubt he quickly dismissed, because people like him did not question their judgments, not without reason, and he was still waiting for that reason to appear. Evelyn's hands moved with increasing fluidity now, her posture straight, her shoulders relaxed, completely unaffected by the audience behind her, as though she were playing in a space where no one watched, where the music existed for itself, and the melody began to deepen, the gentle opening giving way to something richer, more complex, drawing out tones that resonated against the high ceilings and crystal fixtures, filling the room in a way that felt impossible to ignore, and one by one, conversations began to falter, glasses paused midair, and the subtle background noise that had defined the evening started to dissolve into something else entirely. A woman near the center of the room lowered her drink slowly, her brows knitting together in quiet confusion, as if trying to reconcile what she was hearing with what she expected, while another guest shifted his stance, turning fully toward the piano without realizing he had done so. And still, Evelyn did not look up, did not acknowledge the change, because for her, there was no audience. Only the music, unfolding exactly as it was meant to, and as the notes grew more intricate, weaving patterns that demanded attention rather than requested it, the certainty that had filled the room just minutes ago began to crack, replaced by something far less comfortable, the realization that perhaps they had misunderstood something fundamental, and Dominic, for the first time that evening, did not move, did not speak. His usual confidence held in place by a silence he had not intended to create. The melody did not hesitate. It expanded, unfolding with a confidence that could not be faked. And as Evelyn's hands moved across the keys, the music transformed from something merely impressive into something undeniable, something that demanded not just attention but respect. And the room responded in a way no one had planned, because silence, true silence, settled in with a weight that pressed against every polished surface and crystal glass, the kind of silence that only appears when people realize they are witnessing something they cannot interrupt without exposing themselves. Dominic Caldwell remained where he stood, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the piano, but the casual posture he had adopted earlier no longer fit the moment, his fingers stiffening slightly as the sound filled the space around him. And for the first time that evening, his gaze was no longer that of a man observing a spectacle, but of someone trying to understand something that did not align with his expectations. Evelyn's playing deepened, the tempo shifting with precision, her control effortless yet exact, each note placed with intention, building layers that resonated through the high ceilings and echoed back in waves. And though no one spoke, the reactions began to show in smaller ways. A guest setting his glass down more carefully than necessary, another leaning forward just slightly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, and near the back of the room, someone who had been mid-conversation fell, completely still, their unfinished sentence dissolving into the quiet without notice. The music carried emotion that could not be reduced to technique alone. It told something layered and complex, and even those who did not understand the structure could feel the weight of it, the years behind it, the discipline hidden beneath its surface. And that was where the shift truly happened, not in the notes themselves, but in what they revealed about the person playing them. Dominic's jaw tightened just a fraction, a subtle reaction that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment, because he was beginning to recognize something he could not easily dismiss. This was not luck, not a coincidence, not someone stumbling into a moment of competence. This was mastery, controlled and deliberate. And that realization carried with it an uncomfortable implication that his earlier assumptions had not just been incorrect, but completely misplaced. Evelyn did not look at him, did not acknowledge him at all, and that absence of recognition was its own quiet statement, because the power he had tried to assert no longer had a place in what was unfolding. The music had removed him from the center of the moment without effort, and in its place, something else had taken hold, something that did not require permission or approval. A woman near the front of the room placed her hand gently over her chest, her expression softening as the melody reached a passage that seemed to stretch time itself, each note lingering just long enough to leave an impression before giving way to the next. And another guest, a man known for his sharp critiques and impossible standards, found himself unable to look away, his usual skepticism replaced by a quiet, almost reluctant admiration that he did not voice but could not hide. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer differently now, their light catching the movement of Evelyn's hands as they crossed the keyboard with fluid precision, never rushed, never uncertain, and the final sequence of the piece began to build, not with sudden intensity, but with a steady, inevitable rise that pulled every listener along with it, whether they intended to follow or not. Dominic exhaled slowly, though he did not realize he had been holding his breath, and in that small, involuntary action, something shifted within him, not yet acceptance, but the first crack in the certainty he had carried so confidently. And around him, the room remained completely still, no clinking glasses, no whispered comments, only the music, and when the final notes began to approach, there was a collective awareness, unspoken but shared, that whatever came next would not return things to the way they had been before, because the moment had already changed them, quietly, completely, and without asking for permission. The final notes did not crash into silence. They settled into it, lingering in the air like something too complete to be interrupted, and for a long second, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire room had forgotten how to respond to something that had not been part of the script they had expected. And Evelyn's hands remained resting lightly on the keys, not seeking applause, not acknowledging the audience, simply allowing the moment to finish on its own terms. And in that stillness, the truth of what had just happened began to take shape in a way that could not be undone. Dominic Caldwell stood motionless beside the piano, his earlier confidence now replaced by something far less defined, his posture no longer relaxed but held, as if adjusting to a reality he had not prepared for. And though his expression remained controlled, there was a tension beneath it, subtle but unmistakable, because the performance had done more than impress. It had shifted the balance of the room without asking permission, and everyone felt it. A single breath was released somewhere near the back, followed by the faintest sound of a glass being set down, and then, almost cautiously, A pair of hands came together in applause, soft at first, uncertain, as if seeking confirmation that it was appropriate. And when no one objected, others followed, the sound building gradually, not explosive, but steady, respectful, until it filled the space in a way that mirrored the music that had just ended. And yet, even as the applause grew, it carried a different weight, because it was no longer about entertainment, it was acknowledgement. Evelyn lifted her hands from the keys and placed them gently in her lap, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the reaction behind her, and when she finally stood, she did so without turning immediately, as if giving the moment one last breath before stepping away from it. And when she did face the room, her expression remained composed, her eyes steady, not searching for approval, not reacting to the attention, simply present. And that quiet composure held more authority than any gesture Dominic had made all evening. He cleared his throat, a small sound that cut through the applause more sharply than intended, and though he attempted to step forward with the same ease he had displayed earlier, something in his movement had changed, the precision slightly off, the certainty no longer absolute. And when he spoke, his voice was measured, but it lacked the effortless control it had carried before, as if he were choosing each word more carefully than he had expected to need to. That was, he began, then paused, not because he did not have words, but because none of them seemed to fit without revealing too much. And for a moment, the room watched him instead, the focus shifting in a way that had not been part of his design, and he adjusted, offering a small nod, the closest thing to acknowledgement he could manage without surrendering entirely. Impressive. The word hung in the air, insufficient, yet all he allowed himself to give. And Evelyn met his gaze briefly, not with defiance, not with triumph, but with a calm understanding that did not require explanation. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, not victory or defeat, but recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been revealed. Around them, the guests began to shift again, but not back into their previous ease. Conversations resumed more slowly, voices quieter, glances lingering just a moment longer than before, as if each person were recalibrating their place within the room. And the piano, once a decorative centerpiece, now carried a presence that could not be ignored, its silence louder than it had ever been. Evelyn stepped away from the bench, her movements as quiet as when she had approached it, and without waiting for further acknowledgement, she turned toward the edge of the room, returning to the space where she had begun. But the path felt different now, not because the room had changed, but because its perception of her had. And as she picked up the tray she had set down earlier, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, the distance between who she was and who they had assumed her to be became undeniable. Dominic remained by the piano, his gaze following her for a moment longer than necessary, not out of control, but out of something he could not immediately define. And for the first time that evening, he did not have the final word, the final gesture, or the final impression, because the silence that followed her departure from the center of the room did not belong to him. It belonged to what she had left behind, a quiet, irreversible shift that no amount of authority could rewrite. The applause did not fade all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind something quieter, heavier, something that could not be dismissed as just another moment of entertainment. And as the last scattered claps disappeared into the air, the room found itself in an unfamiliar state, not silent, but restrained, as if every voice now carried the awareness that something important had shifted and could not be undone. Evelyn moved through the space with the same quiet precision she had always carried, her presence once overlooked now subtly acknowledged in glances that lingered just a second too long, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of reconsideration. And though no one stopped her, no one called out, the path she walked felt different, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer needed to avoid it. Dominic Caldwell remained where he stood near the piano, his hand no longer resting casually, but placed deliberately on the polished surface as if grounding himself in something stable, his gaze drifting across the room, noting the subtle changes in posture, in tone, in the way conversations resumed with caution rather than ease. And for a man who had built his reputation on control, this was the part he understood best, the invisible shifts that signaled a change in perception, and he recognized it. Immediately, even if he chose not to name it. A guest approached him, offering a polite remark about the performance. But the usual exchange of confident responses did not follow. Instead, Dominic nodded once, briefly, his attention elsewhere, because the narrative he had created earlier in the evening had been interrupted in a way he could not fully reclaim, and that realization settled in quietly, not as defeat, but as something far more inconvenient, an imbalance he could not easily correct. Across the room, Evelyn placed the empty tray onto a side table, her movements unhurried, and for a moment, she paused, not out of hesitation, but reflection, her eyes moving briefly toward the piano, now silent again, yet carrying a presence that could not be erased, and in that glance, there was no longing, no regret, only acknowledgement, as if she had simply revisited something that had always been part of her, something she did not need to explain or defend. A woman who had watched the entire scene from near the center of the room stepped closer, her expression softened, her voice quieter than before as she offered a simple, genuine compliment, not exaggerated, not performative, and Evelyn responded with a small nod, a polite thank you, nothing more, because she did not expand on it, did not shift into conversation, and that restraint carried its own kind of dignity, one that did not seek validation from the same space that had once dismissed her. Dominic finally moved, stepping away from the piano with measured intent, his stride controlled, but lacking the effortless dominance it had carried earlier, and as he approached Evelyn, the room seemed to notice without appearing to, conversations lowering just enough to allow the moment to exist in the open, and when he stopped in front of her, there was a pause, brief but significant, where words were expected, yet not easily chosen. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice even, but stripped of its earlier amusement. "That was not what I anticipated." And though the statement was simple, it carried the weight of admission, however incomplete, and Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if the imbalance between them no longer existed in the same way. "No," she replied softly, her tone calm, not challenging, not deferential, simply true, and in that single word, there was no need for explanation, no need for elaboration, because the moment had already spoken for itself. Dominic inclined his head slightly, a gesture that could have been interpreted as respect or acknowledgement, but did not attempt to define itself further, and as he stepped back, allowing the distance to return, the room seemed to exhale collectively, not in relief, but in recognition that something had concluded, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that left no room for denial. Evelyn turned away once more, returning to her work without ceremony, without any change in pace or posture, and yet everything about how she moved now carried a different meaning, because the room no longer saw her as someone to overlook, and even though she did not claim that shift, did not hold on to it, it remained, woven into the space in a way that could not be undone, and as the evening continued, the music did not return, but its echo remained, subtle and persistent, a reminder that the measure of a person had never been determined by the assumptions made in a single glance, and that sometimes the quietest presence held the strongest truth. The evening did not return to what it had been before, even as conversations resumed, and the soft hum of music from hidden speakers filled the gaps left behind, because something more subtle had taken hold, something that lingered beneath every interaction like a quiet undercurrent, and Dominic Caldwell felt it in the way people spoke to him, not with less respect, but with a slight recalibration, a hesitation that had not existed earlier, as if they were measuring him against something newly revealed. He moved through the room with practiced ease, exchanging words, offering nods, maintaining the image that had taken years to build, yet beneath that surface, his thoughts remained anchored to a moment he could not easily dismiss, replaying the sound of those notes, the precision, the control, and more importantly, the certainty, with which Evelyn Harper had occupied a space he had tried to define for her. Across the ballroom, Evelyn continued her work, collecting empty glasses, adjusting small details, her movements unchanged, but the responses around her were not, because where once there had been indifference, now there were glances that carried recognition, quiet respect, even curiosity, though she did not engage with it, did not invite it. maintaining the same distance she had always kept, as if nothing essential about her had shifted at all. A group of guests near the center spoke in lowered tones, one of them gesturing subtly toward the piano, another shaking his head in disbelief, their words not meant to carry, but their expressions clear enough, because what they had witnessed had not aligned with the assumptions they were accustomed to making, and that discomfort lingered in ways they could not articulate. Dominic paused near the bar, accepting a drink he had not asked for, his gaze drifting once more toward Evelyn, not with the detached curiosity of earlier, but with something more deliberate, as if trying to place her within a framework that no longer fit. And for a man who had built his influence on reading people quickly and accurately, that uncertainty was unfamiliar, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He approached her again, not abruptly, not with the performative authority he had used before, but with a measured pace that suggested intention rather than impulse. And when he reached her, there was no audience gathering this time, no expectation of spectacle, only a quiet moment between two people whose positions had subtly shifted. "You have training," he said, his tone even, not a question, but not entirely a statement either, and Evelyn looked at him briefly, her expression composed, her response unhurried. "Yes," she said simply, offering nothing more, and the brevity of her answer carried more weight than a detailed explanation ever could, because it made clear that what she had shown was not an exception, not a hidden trick, but a part of her that existed independently of his recognition. Dominic nodded once, absorbing the response, and for a moment, he seemed as though he might say something further, something that would restore the balance he preferred, but the words did not come easily, because the usual language of control did not apply here, and anything less would expose the gap he was trying to close. Around them, the room continued its careful rhythm, but the piano remained untouched, its presence now defined not by decoration, but by memory, and no one suggested another performance. No one attempted to recreate what had already passed, because there was an unspoken understanding that it could not be repeated on command, not in the way it had unfolded. Evelyn returned to her tasks without waiting for dismissal, her focus steady, her pace unchanged, and as she moved through the space, the distance between who she was and how she had been perceived earlier in the evening became something no one could ignore, even if they chose not to acknowledge it aloud. Dominic remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching her step away, and in that quiet observation, something shifted within him, not a dramatic realization, not a sudden transformation, but a subtle adjustment, the recognition that control did not always come from asserting power, and that sometimes it was lost the moment it was assumed without understanding, and though he would not say it, not here, not now, the truth had already settled in, quietly, firmly, and without asking for permission. The rhythm of the evening continued, but it no longer flowed with the same careless confidence that had defined it before, because something invisible had settled into the room, something that could not be ignored no matter how carefully people tried to return to their conversations, and Dominic Caldwell felt it most clearly in the spaces between words, in the pauses that lingered just a fraction longer, in the way certain guests now chose their tone more carefully when speaking within his hearing, as if recalibrating not just their perception of Evelyn Harper, but of him as well. He moved toward the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, the lights stretching out in clean lines against the dark horizon, a view that had always reinforced his sense of control, his sense of position, and yet tonight, even that familiar certainty felt slightly altered, not diminished, but questioned in a way he could not immediately correct. Behind him, the piano remained untouched, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light in quiet stillness, and no one approached it. No one suggested another piece, because the unspoken understanding in the room was clear that what had happened earlier was not something to be repeated or replicated, and any attempt to do so would only highlight the difference between performance and presence. Evelyn continued her work along the far side of the ballroom, her movement steady, her focus unchanged, and yet the space around her had shifted in a way that required no announcement, because where once she had been part of the background, now there was a subtle awareness that followed her, not intrusive, not overwhelming, but present, and she neither encouraged nor resisted it, maintaining the same quiet distance that had always defined her place in rooms like this. A younger guest, perhaps new to this circle of influence, approached her with tentative curiosity, asking a simple question about the music, his tone respectful, almost careful, and Evelyn answered with the same calm brevity she had shown before, offering just enough to acknowledge without expanding. And when he thanked her and stepped away, there was a quiet shift in his posture, as if he had learned something he had not expected to encounter that evening. Dominic watched this from across the room, not openly, but with a measured awareness, his gaze returning to her more than once despite himself, because there was something in her restraint that did not align with the patterns he understood. She did not seek attention, did not leverage what had just occurred, did not adjust her behavior to match the room's new perception, and that absence of reaction made the moment more complete, more difficult to reduce or redefine. He set his glass down untouched, the condensation leaving a faint mark on the polished surface beside him, and after a moment, he moved again, not toward the center of attention, but along the edge of the room, his path deliberate, as if following a thought rather than a plan. And when he reached the piano once more, he paused, his hand hovering just above the keys without touching them, not out of hesitation, but consideration, because the instrument no longer belonged to him in the way it had earlier. It no longer served as a prop within his control, but as a quiet reminder of a moment he had not orchestrated. Across the room, Evelyn glanced briefly in his direction, not to meet his eyes, but to register his presence near the piano, and in that fleeting moment, there was no tension, no challenge, only a calm awareness, as if both of them understood that whatever had shifted between them did not require further demonstration. A senior guest, someone who had known Dominic for years, approached him quietly, offering a comment that carried both admiration and subtle implication. Something about unexpected talent appearing in unexpected places, and Dominic listened without interruption, his response measured, a simple acknowledgement that did not fully engage, because he recognized the undertone beneath the words. The reminder that even in controlled environments, unpredictability could redefine a narrative in ways no one could fully manage. The evening moved forward, but its tone had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be spoken about openly, but in the subtle recalibration of perception, of awareness, of how people chose to observe rather than assume. And as Evelyn continued her quiet work, and Dominic maintained his composed presence, the space between them remained unchanged in distance, yet entirely altered in meaning, because the balance that had once been defined by assumption had been replaced by something far more grounded, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And in that quiet understanding, the room carried on, not as it had begun, but as something slightly, irrevocably different. The night moved forward with careful elegance, but beneath the polished surface of conversation and measured laughter, a quiet awareness lingered, threading its way through every exchange, every glance, every subtle shift in posture. And, though no one spoke of it directly, the memory of what had unfolded at the piano remained present, shaping the atmosphere in ways no one could fully ignore. Dominic Caldwell stood once more among his guests, his voice steady, his demeanor composed, yet there was a precision to his movements now, a deliberate control that suggested he was no longer operating on instinct alone, but on something more calculated, more reflective, as if each interaction carried a new layer of consideration he had not needed before. Across the room, Evelyn Harper completed her final tasks, placing the last of the empty glasses onto a tray with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained throughout the evening, her presence still unobtrusive, yet no longer invisible, because even in her silence, she had altered the way the room understood her, and more importantly, the way it understood itself. A senior guest, one whose opinion often carried weight in rooms like this, approached Dominic with a thoughtful expression, his tone lower than usual as he remarked on the unexpected nature of the evening, not with humor, not with dismissal, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that suggested something deeper had been recognized. And Dominic listened, his response measured, offering agreement without elaboration, because he understood that any attempt to redefine what had happened would only diminish his position further. The piano remained untouched, its presence now almost symbolic, a silent witness to a moment that had shifted more than just perception, and no one dared suggest another performance, because the space it occupied had become something else entirely, something that required respect rather than use. Evelyn lifted the tray and made her way toward the service exit, her steps as steady as when she had entered the room hours earlier. But as she passed through the crowd, the subtle parting of space around her was unmistakable, guests moving slightly aside without realizing it, conversations pausing just long enough to register her presence. And though she did not seek it, did not acknowledge it, the shift followed her all the same. Dominic noticed this, his gaze tracking her movement not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because what he saw was not just the result of a single moment, but the quiet consequence of something authentic revealed in a space built on perception, and that distinction was not one he could easily overlook. As Evelyn reached the edge of the room, her hand resting briefly on the door before stepping through, Dominic made a decision that surprised even himself. Moving with purpose toward her, his stride controlled but unmistakably intentional, and when he reached her just before she exited, the moment held a stillness that felt separate from the rest of the evening, as if time had narrowed its focus to this single exchange. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice even, but stripped of any trace of earlier amusement or authority, and when she turned to face him, her expression remained calm, her eyes steady, offering nothing more than attention, not expectation. There was a brief pause, not out of hesitation, but consideration, and when Dominic spoke again, his words were simple, yet carried a weight that had not been present before. "Thank you." It was not an apology, not an admission, but it was not empty either, because it acknowledged something he had not anticipated, something he could not control, and something he now understood, even if only partially. Evelyn regarded him for a moment, her gaze unchanged, and then she gave a small nod, a gesture neither dismissive nor accepting, simply acknowledging the moment for what it was, and without adding anything further, she turned and stepped through the door, leaving behind a room that would continue without her, but not unchanged by her presence. Dominic remained where he stood, the door closing softly behind her, and for a brief moment, he allowed the silence to settle, not the silence of the room, but the quieter one within himself, where certainty had once been absolute, and though he would return to his guests, to his role, to the structure he understood so well, something had shifted in a way that would remain long after the evening ended. A quiet recognition that influence did not always belong to the loudest voice or the most visible presence, and that sometimes it arrived without announcement, reshaped everything, and left just as quietly as it came. The door closed softly behind Evelyn Harper, and for a moment, the sound seemed louder than anything else that had happened that evening, not because of its volume, but because of what it marked, the quiet end of something no one had expected and the beginning of something no one could fully define. And as the ballroom continued behind it, filled with controlled voices and careful laughter, the absence she left behind carried more presence than her quiet movements ever had. Outside, the night air was cool, steady, untouched by the layered expectations of the room she had just stepped away from, and Evelyn paused for a brief second beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights, not to reflect in any dramatic sense, but simply to breathe, to return to a space where no one was watching, no one was measuring, no one was assigning meaning to her existence beyond what it already was. And in that stillness, there was nothing to prove, nothing to reclaim, only a quiet continuity of who she had always been. Inside, Dominic Caldwell remained near the entrance longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on the closed door before he turned back toward his guests, the shift in his posture subtle, yet unmistakable to those who knew him well, because the confidence he carried had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped, refined by something he had not anticipated, something that had revealed a limitation in his understanding of control. And though he would never articulate it in such terms, the awareness remained, steady and present. The evening gradually found its rhythm again, conversations rebuilding, deals continuing, laughter returning in measured tones. But there was a difference now, a quiet restraint that had not been there before, because the people in that room had witnessed something that could not be reduced to entertainment, something that had challenged the assumptions they relied on without asking permission. And even as they moved forward, that awareness lingered beneath their words, shaping them in ways they did not fully acknowledge. Dominic resumed his role. With practiced ease, speaking with clarity, offering insights, maintaining the presence that had defined his reputation. Yet there were moments, brief and almost imperceptible, when his gaze drifted toward the piano, now silent, its polished surface reflecting the room as it had before, but no longer holding the same meaning, because it had become something else entirely, a quiet reminder that control was not absolute, that perception could shift in an instant, and that the most significant moments were often the ones that arrived without invitation. Later, as the final guests began to leave, their farewells polite, their expressions thoughtful, Dominic stood near the center of the room, acknowledging each departure with the same composed demeanor, but the subtle difference remained, not in what he said, but in how he listened, as if weighing words more carefully than before, as if understanding that influence was not only about being heard, but about recognizing what had been overlooked. The staff moved quietly in the background, restoring order, clearing tables, resetting the space for whatever would come next, and among them, Evelyn's absence was noted not with commentary, but with a quiet recognition that something had shifted, not just for her, but for everyone who had been present. As the last light dimmed and the room settled into stillness, the piano remained at the center, untouched, its silence now complete, and in that silence, the memory of the music lingered, not as sound, but as meaning, a reminder that dignity did not announce itself, did not demand attention, but revealed itself in moments when it was least expected, and once seen, it could not be unseen. And though the night would be remembered for many reasons, for deals discussed and connections made, for the elegance of the setting and the prestige of those who attended, there was one truth that would remain beneath it all, quiet and unspoken, that the measure of a person had never been determined by where they stood in the room, but by what they carried within them, and that sometimes the most powerful presence was the one that never needed to claim it, because it was already undeniable.